The first day at the boutique felt like stepping onto a stage where I didn't belong. The store was pristine, glass shelves lined with designer bags, mannequins posed in effortless elegance. The scent of expensive perfume hung in the air, a cruel reminder of a life I had lost. My name tag, hastily pinned onto my borrowed uniform, looked as out of place on me as I felt in this world of quiet luxury. I stood behind the register, my hands resting on the polished countertop, feigning confidence I didn't possess. The other employees, young and sharp, whispered among themselves, casting me sidelong glances. They knew who I was. They had seen the headlines, the social media gossip. Olivia Warren, former socialite, now reduced to working retail. A woman approached the counter, her sharp gaze raking over me before she set down a pair of leather gloves. "Aren't you Richard Warren's ex-wife?" she asked, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. For a moment, I considered lying. Pretending I was someone else. But there was no use in denial, the world already knew my story. I said, forcing a polite smile as I rang up her purchase. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head as if amused. "I suppose life comes at you fast, doesn't it?" My grip on the register tightened, but I kept my face neutral. If there was one thing I had learned in my marriage, it was how to mask discomfort with practiced indifference. I handed her the elegantly wrapped bag, and she sauntered away, whispering something to her companion. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of awkward interactions and silent judgment. By the time I left, my feet ached, and my pride was in shambles. I had never had to work a day in my life, never imagined I would need to. Marriage, I had once believed, was a shield against struggle. A foolish, childish fantasy. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, pedestrians lost in their own concerns. I walked aimlessly, unwilling to return to the tiny apartment that now served as my home. Compared to the estate I had shared with Richard, it felt suffocating, a stark reminder of everything I had lost. When I finally reached my building, the exhaustion settled deep in my bones. I kicked off my shoes, let my coat slip from my shoulders, and collapsed onto the couch. The silence was unbearable. No hum of household staff moving about, no distant sound of Richard's voice on the phone. Just me, alone, in a space that felt foreign. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A single new email. I hesitated before opening it. The sender was unfamiliar, the message brief. "You were never meant to be happy." A chill ran down my spine. I read the words again, my breath catching in my throat. It could have been some cruel joke, another jab at my downfall. And yet, something about it felt different. Calculated. Personal. I deleted the message, but its presence lingered in my mind long after I turned off the lights. My father's office was as I remembered, cold, impersonal, designed more for intimidation than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, but the beauty of it was lost beneath the sterile gleam of marble floors and the weight of his presence. Henry Caldwell sat behind an imposing desk, fingers steepled as he regarded me with a look I had spent my entire life deciphering. It wasn't warmth, nor was it outright hostility. It was calculation, as if even this meeting were a move on some invisible chessboard. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since he turned his back on me for marrying Richard. His silence had been deafening, his absence a wound I had learned to ignore. Yet, here I was, summoned like an errand employee rather than a daughter, sitting in a chair that felt too small under the scrutiny of a man who had built an empire with nothing but his ruthlessness. "I assume you know why you're here," he said finally, his voice measured. I folded my hands in my lap, resisting the urge to shift under his gaze. "I don't, actually. You cut me off years ago. I assumed you intended to keep it that way." His lips twitched, not quite a smile. Things change. I let the silence stretch, unwilling to play whatever game he had in mind. If there was one thing I had learned from my father, it was that nothing he did was without purpose. I have an offer for you, he continued, leaning back in his chair. You need a job. I need someone I can trust. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Trust? That's rich, coming from you. His expression didn't shift. If my defiance irritated him, he didn't show it. You've spent years living in luxury, believing it would last forever. Now you're learning that comfort is fleeting. But you're a Caldwell, Olivia. Your place is here, not behind some counter selling handbags to women who used to be your peers. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had spent years convincing myself that love was enough, that marriage to Richard meant security. Now, I had nothing to show for it except a tiny apartment and the humiliation of starting over. What's the catch? I asked, because there was always one. His gaze sharpened. I want you in the company. A public return to the family. There are assets tied to your name that could be beneficial. It was a carefully veiled truth. He didn't need me, he needed control over something I didn't yet understand. I crossed my arms, narrowing my eyes. And if I refuse? For the first time, his expression hardened. Then you can keep struggling. Keep pretending you can survive in a world you were never prepared for. But I promise you, Olivia, this is the only offer of goodwill you'll get from me. I wanted to tell him to go to hell. To remind him that he had abandoned me first. But the truth was, I wasn't in a position to refuse. Fine, I said, my voice steady. I'll do it. His approval was silent, a slight nod as he reached for a folder on his desk. He slid it toward me, tapping a long finger against the cover. This is everything you need to know about the role. You start Monday. I took the folder, but before I could stand, his next words stopped me cold. One more thing, he said, watching me carefully. Stay out of anything related to the Morrow Agreement. I frowned. What's that? His jaw tightened, just enough for me to notice. Nothing that concerns you. But the way he said it, the way his tone shifted ever so slightly, sent a ripple of unease through me. I recognized avoidance when I saw it. My father never dismissed things lightly. As I left his office, the folder heavy in my hands, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever the Morrow Agreement was, it concerned me more than he wanted to admit. I spent the first week at Caldwell Enterprises drowning in expectations I wasn't prepared for. My father's empire was built on precision, power, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that left no room for weakness. Every meeting, every contract, every decision was a move in a game I had barely begun to understand. But I wasn't blind. I saw the way the board members watched me, the barely concealed skepticism in their expressions. I was a liability to them, a woman who had fallen from grace and was now attempting to climb back up without the proper weapons. I kept my head down, learning the intricacies of the company, but my mind kept circling back to the one thing my father had warned me against. The Morrow Agreement. It lingered like an unanswered question, pressing at the edges of my thoughts. No one mentioned it, and when I searched the internal files, I found nothing, no contracts, no records, nothing to explain why my father had been so quick to shut me down when I asked about it. It wasn't until I overheard the conversation that I realized just how deep the secrecy ran. I had stayed late, trying to make sense of the maze of legal documents I was drowning in, when I heard my father's voice from the hallway. The door to his office was slightly ajar, just enough for the words to slip through. "We have a problem," he said, his tone clipped, controlled. The Morrow Agreement was supposed to be buried, another voice responded. A man, someone I didn't recognize. If Olivia starts digging, she could connect the dots. A pause. Then my father's voice again, lower this time. Then make sure she doesn't. I barely breathed as footsteps echoed down the hall. I pressed myself against the cool wood of the desk, waiting until the voices faded before slipping out of the office unnoticed. My pulse hammered in my ears. They were hiding something from me. And if there was one thing I knew about my father, it was that whatever he buried was never meant to be found. The next morning, I did what I had been taught to do my entire life. I smiled, played the part, and pretended I wasn't unraveling at the seams. But beneath that, I was searching. The more I looked, the more I realized that the Morrow Agreement wasn't just missing from the company records, it had been erased. Any trace of it, any documentation, gone. Almost as if it had never existed. There was only one other person I knew who might have answers. I found Richard exactly where I expected him to be, on the rooftop terrace of the private club he had frequented since before our marriage. It was a place where men like him brokered deals over whiskey, where power was measured in whispered conversations and exchanged favors. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked amused. Olivia, he drawled, setting his glass down with an easy grace that still infuriated me. I was wondering when you'd come crawling back. I sat across from him, ignoring the way my stomach twisted. Once, I had loved this man. Once, I had thought he was my future. Now, he was nothing more than a well-dressed reminder of my mistakes. I'm not here for you, I said, keeping my voice steady. I need answers. He smirked, tilting his head. That depends on the questions. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. The Morrow Agreement. What is it? For the first time, his expression faltered. It was subtle, just a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, but I saw it. He recovered quickly, reaching for his drink, but the air between us had shifted. Where did you hear that name? He asked, voice measured. My father mentioned it. Or rather, he didn't. Which tells me it's something I should be looking into. Richard exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the glass. Then, with a small, almost pitying smile, he said, Olivia, some things are better left buried. I hated the way he said my name, like I was still his to patronize, still the naive woman who had once believed he would protect me. I didn't flinch. Tell me the truth. He studied me for a long moment before setting his drink aside. Fine, he said, voice quieter now. You want the truth? Your father and I made a deal long before you and I ever met. Our marriage wasn't about love, Olivia. It was about power. The Morrow Agreement tied our families together, financially, legally. It was a way to consolidate influence. But things changed. Your father wanted out. My breath hitched. Wanted out? His gaze darkened. Your mother's death wasn't an accident. The words slammed into me, stealing the air from my lungs. My mother. Gone for years, her death ruled a tragic accident. A car crash. Nothing more. I gripped the edge of the table. You're lying. I wish I were, Richard said, and for the first time that night, he looked serious. Whatever your father did to break the agreement, it cost him more than just money. And now, you're walking straight into the mess he left behind. I stood abruptly, my mind a storm of unanswered questions, my heart pounding in my chest. Richard didn't try to stop me. He simply watched as I turned to leave, his expression unreadable. As I stepped out into the night air, one thought echoed louder than the rest. I had spent years believing I had control over my own life. But I had never been anything more than a piece on a board set in motion long before I even knew I was playing. I spent the next 24 hours trapped in a fog of disbelief and rage. The walls of my apartment felt smaller with every passing second, the air thick with the weight of what Richard had told me. My mother's death wasn't an accident. The words clung to me, sinking into my bones. My father had always been ruthless in business, but murder? The thought made me sick. I needed proof. I barely slept, poring over old news articles, financial records, anything I could find that might explain what the Morrow Agreement really was. But every thread I pulled only led to dead ends, erased files, and whispers of something bigger than I had imagined. If my father had killed my mother to sever his ties with Richard's family, there had to be evidence somewhere. By morning, my course was set. I wasn't going to let this remain buried. When I arrived at Caldwell Enterprises, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. I walked past my father's assistant, ignoring her protests as I pushed open the heavy doors to his office. He sat at his desk, looking as composed as ever, but I saw the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Olivia," he said, setting his pen down. "What is the meaning of this?" I dropped a thick folder onto his desk. The Morrow Agreement. For the first time, I saw something close to unease flash across his face. He didn't move to open the folder. "You've been busy," he said after a long pause. "You lied to me," I snapped, my voice shaking with fury. "Richard told me everything. Our marriage was nothing more than a business move. And my mother," I swallowed hard, the words almost too painful to say. "Her death wasn't an accident, was it?" His jaw tightened. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment." "Don't patronize me," I shot back. "Did you have her killed?" Silence. It stretched between us, suffocating, unbearable. And then, finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I did what had to be done," he admitted, his voice devoid of remorse. "Your mother wanted out. She threatened to expose everything. If she had, it would have destroyed us all." A hollow feeling settled in my chest. "She was your wife. And she was a liability," he said, as if that justified everything. "I built this empire with my own hands, Olivia. Do you think I was going to let it all crumble because of her conscience?" I had spent my entire life trying to earn his approval, believing that somewhere beneath the cold exterior, he cared about me. But now I saw the truth. He was incapable of love. His only loyalty was to his power. I stood there, shaking, as realization hit me. I would never be free as long as I remained under his control. "You're a monster," I whispered. His expression didn't change. "And you are my daughter. Which means you have a choice: walk away and live in ignorance, or stay and learn how the world really works." I stared at him, the man who had shaped my life, the man I had once admired. And in that moment, I made my decision. I turned and walked out of his office. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. My entire life had been built on lies, but I wasn't going to be another casualty of my father's greed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message. "You were never meant to be happy." The same message from before. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Because now, I knew exactly who had sent it. And I knew exactly what I had to do.